Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 15th Street Meetinghouse and to Friends Seminary for our annual Peace Week lecture. Before we go any further, I'd like to do two things. One is to ask you to disable your cell phones and anything else that might interrupt us tonight. And I would ask you, in the manner of friends, to join us as we collectively center into a few moments of silence. While Quaker values, including the peace testimony, are ever present in our school, tonight is the culmination of a particularly intense period of exploration of peace and economic justice for our faculty and students. We all know that the United States and our world continue to face significant economic challenges. In planning this year's Peace Week, our committee thought these times invited consideration by our faculty and students of how economics shapes peace and justice, both locally and globally. We hope that by trying to get beyond the numbers, and that can be hard in these days of data-driven information, our students could see how our current economic system reflects specific assumptions about economic growth. We wanted them to ask why some live in luxury while others struggle to survive, an economic dichotomy perhaps nowhere more jarringly evident than in our own city. We wanted them to see that numbers are a scaffolding of sorts, that they represent a complex web that, in the end, supports human lives. In investigating how the current economic crisis came about, the planning committee hoped our students would begin to understand inspirational examples of collaborative business practices that are changing the economic landscape today, such as sustainable development and the fair trade movement. By learning about various economic systems, we believe our students are in a better place to shape the future and to bring about the world that ought to be. This is the hope of the Peace Week Planning Committee and of all who have so generously participated in Peace Week activities. Jeffrey Sachs is widely considered to be the leading international economic advisor of his generation, and is also one of the leading voices for combining economic development with environmental sustainability. And as such, we are especially thrilled to have him here at Friends Seminary as part of our Peace Week, Beyond the Numbers, the Economics of Peace. Professor Sachs is also president and co-founder of Millennium Promise Alliance, a nonprofit organization aimed at ending extreme global poverty. As director of the Earth Institute, he leads large-scale efforts to promote the mitigation of human-induced climate change. Professor Sachs was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. We are very grateful that you are here, Professor Sachs. We await your words with anticipation, and we welcome you to Friends Seminary.
Thank you so much. Any place that has a Peace Week is compelling, and I'm very, very grateful to be part of it. I'm going to hold this and then step away from the podium so I can see you and we can have a nice discussion together. You raised a lot of complicated issues in this week and in your introduction. Why is there such an extreme of wealth and poverty? How do our economic systems and this incredible range of economic life on the planet affect the prospects for peace and for war? And I want to talk about one particular, but I believe extremely important part of this larger set of puzzles, and that is how we might pursue peace a bit differently from the way we're doing it right now. We're engaged in a lot of war. As you know, we're engaged in war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We are increasingly engaged in military actions in Yemen. We've been strafing villages in Somalia. and we have a new Africa Command, which has American forces operating throughout much of the African continent. I believe we're not solving any of our problems this way, and I believe that there's a better way. And the better way is the title of my brief remarks this evening, Peace Through Sustainable Development. I think one of the most important aspects of our military conundrum right now is that we find ourselves engaged militarily in very, very poor parts of the world. And that's no coincidence. One of the most powerful statistical relations, you warned us against numbers, but I'll just cite a powerful correlation, is that the prevalence of violence and conflict in our world is strongly associated with the presence of poverty. And in my view, and based on the experience that I've had over the past 30 years, poverty is a direct cause of conflict because hungry people and hungry societies are subject to fall into violence. They are susceptible to the calls of demagoguery or extremism. Poor people lead desperate lives, and desperation turns into violence for many, many reasons. We're in a situation of bombing poor people in many parts of the world, and not one of those bombs is making those people better off, getting them water, helping them grow more food, or solving any of the real problems that led to the violence that drew us into their conflicts in the first place. And what I'd like to do over a period of 20 or 25 minutes is introduce you to some of these places, explain a little bit of that causation as I see it, what we might do about it, and then turn our meeting into an open discussion, which I would very much appreciate. This is a place in northern Ethiopia where my wife Sonia and I work. Sonia's here this evening with me and with my daughter Hannah. And this was an extraordinary scene that we came upon when we visited this village called Kararo in Tigray province, Ethiopia, a few years ago. I had never seen anything quite like it. What you're seeing are the men of the village digging a hole in the middle of a dry riverbed. So the river, which was a perennial river of this village, had run dry, partly because water was being taken off upstream, but most importantly because the rains have declined substantially in this area, as is true in many parts of the world. Probably, not conclusively, a signal of long-term human-induced climate change. Whatever the reason, whether it's cyclical over a course of decades or whether it's long-term due to climate change, this is a dry area where the community was at the edge of survival because of the failure of the short rains at the time that we visited. And the men were digging a hole in the middle of the riverbed to get to the water table, which was now a couple of meters below the surface of the riverbed, and they were carrying water up to the fields. This is happening all over the place, but I'd never seen it before. The idea of digging your wells in your former river, which was the reason why your village existed there in the first place. It is a sign of being at the edge of survival. I can tell you that through the kind of work that I'll talk about in just a few minutes, this village has a new lease on life, but it's a kind of desperation that is prevalent across a span of more than 10,000 miles across Africa, the Middle East, and into Central Asia. This is a little bit hard to see, but it's a map that is color-coded according to water stress, in essence, or drought probability. And what you can see is that the United States, especially on our east coast, is green, and most of Europe is green. And the coastal China, of course, where a vast population of hundreds of millions of people live in the China plains of the Yangtze and the Yellow River, and the Pearl River is green. And parts of northern India and the Indo-Gangetic plains and going into Bangladesh are green. But there's a huge stretch of most of Africa, other than the Congo Basin, and into the Arabian Peninsula, and into Asia, Asia Minor, Anatolia, and into Western Asia, into Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, and into the Central Asian republics of the former Soviet Union that are all brown. This is a large area of the so-called drylands of the planet. This dark band of brown across Africa from Senegal through Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea is the Sahel of Africa, one of the most fragile parts of the entire world. And where that picture was taken was in northern Ethiopia, just about where I'm pointing here. These dryland areas are among the most fragile environments of the world. Inherently, they receive very little rainfall. And when the rains fail, because of the low average level of rainfall, crop failures are, of course, ever possible. And everybody remembers the famous famines of the Sahel of the 1980s and the famous famine of Ethiopia of 1984, which was one of the most noted events of our time. But this region is constantly facing famines, maybe 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 years. There's a catastrophe underway throughout the Horn of Africa right now. Now, if you correlate the drylands, the shifting patterns of precipitation, and the outbreaks of violence in the last 30 years, you find, of course, an extraordinarily disconcerting association. This is a map that I prepared for a recent book called Commonwealth, which overlaid the dryland regions, which are shown here in the yellows and kind of greenish colors, with the areas of conflict in 2006, 2007, shown by the triangles. And what you see is that most of the violent conflicts in the world, actually, during recent years, are first of all conflicts of breakdown within societies, as in Somalia or as in Ethiopia, or in Darfur, in Sudan, which everybody knows, or our cross-border conflicts, Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now we have the violence in Yemen that people are reading about. Of course, people know about the piracy in Somalia and its effects on Red Sea trade. They're not as aware of necessarily what's happening inside Somalia. And of course, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan here. There is an incredible relationship between the drylands and the sites of these conflicts. Not every conflict is in the drylands, not every dryland is conflict-ridden, but the propensity towards conflict is certainly related to the vulnerability to drought. Essentially, the conflicts that we're seeing, in my opinion, but I have to tell you, I've not been able to convince all that many generals, presidents, or other military strategists, are not conflicts that are predominantly conflicts of ideology, conflicts of extremism, conflicts of Islam, conflicts even of Al-Qaeda. These are conflicts of desperate places that are then preyed upon because they're falling to pieces by all sorts of demagoguery, movements, flow of arms, and so forth. And it's no accident, in my opinion, that we see this pattern, because these are the very poorest and most vulnerable places in the world. That picture in northern Ethiopia exemplifies what you would find in communities anywhere. When Sonia and I visited, and Hannah visited Yemen a few years ago, in 2005, we left feeling that that was another tinderbox that was ripe for explosion. In fact, we were in Sana'a, we were taken around in communities near the capital. Everywhere we went, we heard of rain failures, of famine, of water shortages, of hunger. 2 weeks after we left 5 years ago, there were riots in the exact alleyways that we had walked in Sana'a. I came back, talked to my colleagues at the United Nations, U.S. government and so forth, had no effect whatsoever. 5 years later, all of a sudden, Yemen is in the headlines that it's an Al-Qaeda terrorist zone. Well, in the interim, we did absolutely zero to actually help Yemen grow food, face its climate change, or in other ways to adapt to its extraordinarily harsh and increasingly harsh climate. Here's some more numbers. I hate to do it after the warning, but the numbers are important. This is a graph of rainfall in Darfur, one of the horrific sites of humanitarian disaster in the past decade, although a little bit quieter right now. And this is a timeline from a weather station, El Fasher weather station, in south-central Darfur, stretching from around 1920 till basically 2006. And this is the average level of precipitation, I think, average for the entire period. And what you see is that in the years up to around 1970, the rainfall was relatively ample, though this is an arid zone to begin with. So we're talking about probably 500 or 600 millimeters of rainfall per year. But since the early 1970s, Darfur experienced a long period of disastrous rain failures, a sharp decline of rainfall. What happened when this occurred? Of course, in the 1980s, people in Darfur, which is a marginalized area in the west of Sudan, faced hunger. The livestock of the pastoralist communities were dying in large numbers. And when people can't find enough to eat and find the grasslands to graze their animals, they migrate. And in Darfur, the migration was from the very dry north to the only semi-dry but still very dry south. And so nomadic communities from the north of Darfur came to the south and fought with the existing communities over this very scarce water supply. This was the origin of the Darfur crisis, water scarcity. And the intruding tribes, which were of different ethnicity, used violence and fear to try to chase the local communities in the south away so that these northern nomadic tribes could gain access to the water. Khartoum ended up intervening on behalf of certain of the groups, and there was a massive spread of violence as a result of this. The fact that this Darfur crisis had its roots in water scarcity was almost completely unacknowledged in the global discourse and even in our national discourse over this. This was viewed as primarily a fight against government, Islamic government in Khartoum. This was viewed mainly through ethnic or political lens. There was essentially no attention given whatsoever to the fact that this was an area of hunger, and that the only possible real solutions were solutions to the hunger. Even our own NGO movements that were addressing this crisis and drawing public attention to it, in my opinion, did not properly indicate that at the core of this was an economic and a humanitarian disaster, which was the provocation for the subsequent violence, so that one needed a developmental approach to a crisis like this, rather than the military, peacekeeping, no-fly zone, or other kinds of approaches. Our government never proposed it. Basically, until today, we viewed this through a military and security lens rather than through the hunger lens that it is. And of course, these are the pictures that you see in these zones, but the origins of this are obscured. This is a map of Afghanistan from this past year, and it again is a color-coded map showing rainfall relative to normal. What you see is that in 2008, Afghanistan had one of the worst famines in its modern history, with the collapse of food production as well. How many times did you read about that in all of the deliberations over war in Afghanistan? I don't remember hearing about it one time, by the way. And I can tell you, as odd as it seems, for me, these are the compelling first things that one would say about any crisis like this. One can go months or years in the officialdom without hearing the most basics even discussed. And I could mention in that regard, in Darfur, I've said on every occasion that I could inside the United Nations, this is a crisis of water and hunger. No traction almost at all on that. One day, I got a call, now it was about 2 years ago, Jeff, please come to the UN. We're going to have a high-level meeting about water in Darfur. I said, finally, thank God, we're going to have some attention to this most obvious cause. I got to the meeting. It was a high-level meeting convened by DPKO, which is the peacekeeping part of the United Nations. What was the purpose of the meeting? It wasn't exactly as I thought. The problem, as explained by the head of DPKO, was that the peacekeeping mission was to deploy 26,000 troops, and they could not find a place to deploy them that had adequate water. So I, perhaps not very constructively, said, that's very interesting. There are 7 million people in Darfur. Maybe that gives you some idea. And they said, Jeff, that's fine, I know, but we're here for the peacekeeping, please. And I tried a couple of times and made no headway. And so even at that final moment where you're trying to find how to provide water for 26,000 troops, it's almost impossible to get a focus on the fact that there are millions of people who are living day in, day out without the water that you also can't find for the troops that would be brought in. Well, in Afghanistan, it's no different. This is a dryland region. It's a hungry country. It's got some of the worst social statistics in the world in terms of child stunting and wasting, prevalence of adult hunger, propensity to famine, child mortality, and so forth. But to this moment, we simply are unable in this country to focus on the developmental aspects of this. And I can tell you as a regular blogger that if you try, you hear a lot hurled back in your face. We don't care, we got to wipe out the bad guys, or we just should get the heck out of there entirely. but almost no consideration for the fact that there are hungry people and desperately poor people whose children can't go to school, who don't have enough to eat, and that maybe this is itself one of the primary causal factors for this crisis. What Sonia and I and colleagues at the Earth Institute and many, many hundreds of colleagues in Africa have been trying to do in recent years is to address these on-the-ground challenges through practical approaches, very systematic, science-based and engineering-based approaches to the questions of hunger, water, health, basic infrastructure, schooling in impoverished communities. And I wanted briefly to introduce you to this project. It's called the Millennium Villages Project. It now is in 15 countries, and it covers between 500 and 600,000 people. The idea is to use state-of-the-art systematic approaches to the key sectors of a village society. Those are agriculture, health, education, infrastructure, business development, and environmental conservation, and use the best of our science and the best of our technology so that at low cost one could find some solutions to the problems of places like that village, Kararo, Ethiopia, whose picture we saw at the beginning of the project. This is a color-coded map of Africa showing different agroecological zones. One of the purposes of the project is to try to understand how each part of Africa in terms of climate affects the reality of lives of the people on the continent, and to try to find solutions that are appropriate agroecologically in each zone, whether it's the maize-growing regions of East Africa, whether it's the teff growing regions of the highlands of Ethiopia, whether it's the drylands of the Sahel. Here is Pampaita, Nigeria, whether it's Toya, Mali, or just a little bit, actually right here, just on the bend of the Niger River, where Timbuktu is located and where we have an operation, or the so-called derived savanna on the edge of the rainforest in Bonsaso, Ghana, where we visited just a couple of weeks ago. The idea is to try to look for practical solutions in each of these places. The fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, this is the wonderful news about science and technology. There are so many powerful things that can be done, and at extraordinarily low cost. If we were only to invest a little bit of our national energy and wisdom through peaceful approaches, we would not only rally the goodwill of the world, we would solve the problems that are the provocations to so much of the violence that we see. These are maize fields of Mwandama, Malawi. It's a picture of how maize has gone from about 1 ton per hectare planted before 2005 to 4 or 5 tons afterwards, simply using good agronomy. Better fertilizer, better organics, better seed varieties, and so forth. And it's turned communities throughout Malawi from famine-ridden communities to food surplus communities. There are now thousands and thousands of metric tons of surplus grain that these villages have been able to store in recent years, which they used in a current shortfall because of failed rains, simply by applying best practices of agronomy as advised by our colleagues and their partners in Africa. With the health sector, it's absolutely incredible what one can do to reduce infant and child mortality at extraordinarily low cost. Sonia is a medical doctor, a pediatrician, and a public health specialist. She directs the health systems approach in the Millennium Villages. This is a picture of taking an arm circumference in Sauri, a village in western Kenya. And when we went just a few weeks ago to revisit this village, not only are they doing the arm circumference, which is critical to flag deep undernourishment and the need for nutritional supplementation, for example, but now we've been able to help train community health workers who carry mobile phones, which of course were themselves not available even till a few years ago. The mobile phones are now coded in a system called Rapid SMS, where the community health worker, who is a high school graduate from her village, codes in the patient's ID number and then the arm circumference or perhaps the result of a malaria diagnostic test, and within a few seconds comes an expert system response to advise her what to do: bring the child to the clinic, revisit once a week, start an anti-malarial treatment, and so forth. And so young people from the village who perhaps have 6 months of health training are able to disperse life-saving medicines in the community, life-saving treatment, or be the interface between impoverished people in the community and the clinic, and to save lives. And we're seeing a stark reduction of infant and child mortality rates by introducing these simple systems. By the way, you know, our healthcare system costs more than $7,000 per person per year. What we're showing is that at $50 per person per year in the setting of Sowry, it's possible to reduce child mortality rates by 30 to 50% within a 3-year period. It's a matter of being systematic and applying best practices in public health. This is the famous long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets made by Sumitomo Chemical, these Oliset nets. Another work of humble-seeming but life-changing technology. Bed nets are a remarkably effective way to reduce malaria disease burden and also to break transmission. Now, they work partly by the mechanical barrier, partly by what's called excitorepellency of the insecticide on the net. And Sumitomo Chemical did something absolutely wonderful a few years ago. It used to be that you dip the net in insecticide, and that insecticide treatment would last a few months. You might wash the net and wash off the insecticide and then have to retreat the net. That simple act of getting insecticide and treating the net safely and so forth was beyond the capacity of distant villages. And so nets would not be retreated, and without the insecticide, they're vastly less effective, less than half as effective as an insecticide-treated net. So this chemical company, Sumitomo Chemical, devised a way to put the insecticide into the resin before the net is actually knit. And now every time you wash the net, the insecticide is extruded into the surface of this mesh, and that lasts for 5 to 7 years without actively having to retreat the net. Hundreds of millions of these nets are now being distributed. Sumitomo Chemicals and other companies, Vestergaard and Bayer and so forth. But the simple fact of now having 5-year non-retreatable nets available is reducing malaria burden tremendously. If you combine it with that rapid SMS that I talked about, if you combine it with best practice first-line medicines, which are called artemisinin and combination drugs, which cost all of 80 cents per pediatric dose made by Novartis, you can bring malaria burden down, as Sonia and her team have done in Sowry, by 90% within a 3-year period. And this is another example of what can be done in these communities. 5 years ago, there were no computers, no electricity, and no prospect that children would be able to get on the internet and Google Friend Seminary. But within 5 years, everything has changed. The most important and dramatic change is that mobile telephony is everywhere now. It is even in the war zones. Putting up towers turns out to be such a low-cost and high return venture that even in impoverished rural Africa, there is not quite universal phone connectivity, but you can almost always find a hill or a tree where you can get the connectivity. And we partner with Ericsson in the Millennium Villages project, and Ericsson has wonderfully put up towers wherever we're engaged with villages so that there is now universal connectivity. And with the wireless broadband that's gone along with 3G, now there can be computer labs online, solar panel, way off the grid, that are bringing kids into the information age in places that would have been thought to be impossible just a few years ago. And this is the Millennium Village in Mayanji, Rwanda. And of course, the question of safe drinking water, as I started with, is a paramount issue. Actually, when you think about water use, about 70% or more of water use by society is for agriculture. And so the first and most urgent call of water at scale is for the crops. About 10% of water use is for human need, household need, but without it, you don't survive more than a few days. And there are countless technologies for making local spring water or other sources of water safe. In Bonsaso, again, we saw this just a few weeks ago, the water has metals in it which are dangerous if taken in a large amount. And the local community devised a wonderful purification system by simply putting the spring water through sand and gravel and charcoal and drawing out the metals from the water and producing a safe and clean and readily available water supply for the community. This is our camel village, part of the Drylands region, a place called Darfur in northern Kenya. I wanted to end with the photo tour of the villages with Darfur, because this is a place right on the Somalia border. And indeed, the people in this community are Somali ethnicity. The local language spoken is Somali. There's a lot of migration across the border. By the way, American security folks hate that migration, but that's normal life. In the drylands, you move with the rains, you move with the grasslands. We put these artificial borders up and barbed wire and disrupt people's lives and societies miserably, make it almost impossible to survive in some cases. But in this area, nearby is one of the world's largest refugee camps of Somali and displaced Ugandan population. But this community is a peaceful community, and it's peaceful because there's a 15 kV generator which pumps groundwater and provides ample water for the livestock. There are now boarding schools, there is internet connectivity, there's cell phone use, there's an Ericsson tower which has connected the pastoralists with their markets in Port Said and in Nairobi and at other points on the Red Sea. So instead of walking your camels for 3 weeks to find out that there's no demand at the place to which you've migrated, you now make a phone call and find out what the price of your sheep, goats, and camels is, and life is completely changed as a result of all of this. What is the United States doing about this? Just about nothing. And very little's changed, unfortunately, with the new administration. And the new budget that just came out changed almost nothing as well. In fact, President Obama, I'm sorry to say, has asked for the biggest military budget in the history of the United States. Not as a proportion of GNP, but in absolute numbers. Secretary Gates testified last week in support of a $768 billion military budget. He didn't even have words to justify it. I found that he was using the most vague phrases which know that you've been given so much that you don't even know what to say. He said we needed multiple capabilities to answer the uncertain circumstances that may arise. In other words, they gave me $760 billion, and we'll find some use to put to it. This is the budget request. It's actually, in this definition, only $748 billion. This is our peaceful development budget, $28.8 billion, just to give you some idea of the difference of scale. This is how we invest in our security through the military. This is how we invest in our security through peaceful development. In Afghanistan, we will spend $100 billion this year on the war, and we will budget $1 billion, 1/100th of that, for development in Afghanistan. I have almost no theories to explain this. There is no sense in the world for us to be doing this. Think about the fact that every single troop, every individual we send to Afghanistan costs $1 million to station for a year. And you could support a whole village for that. You could build schools, clinics, agriculture, water supplies for one soldier. So we're spending $100 billion. Oops. Wait a minute. Today in the Financial Times, and I'll end here, there was maybe a little hint of some of this. Just a list of the big contractors and the contracts awarded in 2009. Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Raytheon, familiar names, and the tens of billions of dollars of military contracts. And here was their lobbying spending in 2009. We remain in the grips of the arms industry. We remain in the grips of arms contractors. We remain in the grips of our own mythology and our lack of awareness. I was shocked to see in one picture on the days that the President and his cabinet were deliberating on Afghanistan and on the surge, there were 17 people around the table in the Situation Room photographed by the New York Times, 16 white men, 1 white woman, the Secretary of State, nobody that had knowledge about Afghanistan professionally. I don't think one native speaker, not one person out of the 17 that had development knowledge or experience. Given the combination of money and politics, our blindness to ground realities, and the nature of our politics right now, one can see how we can get ourselves deeper and deeper into a profound crisis that is otherwise solvable at a tiny fraction of the money and certainly at an even tinier fraction of the lives that we are finding expendable these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Fascinating insights into a bleak situation. And I'm sure that there are questions in the audience, and Jeff has graciously agreed to give us a few more minutes. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I would ask, since we're taping this, if you would speak into the microphone.
Thank you, Professor. And let me just preface what I'm about to ask by saying that what I'm about to say doesn't in any way call into question one bit of your analysis, but one of the criticisms that many, including those who support increasing substantially the amount of development funds going to Africa, for instance, is that it's an area which is so affected by corruption that the money isn't delivered to the people that need it the most. And I was wondering if you could comment on your experience both in working with the UN and also doing your own sort of quasi-privatized projects and see what your experience with that has been.
Yeah, I've often said that there is corruption everywhere, not just in Washington. There is also some corruption in Africa too. Not anywhere near the scale of the Washington corruption, but still meaningful. I'm not a huge believer in handing over money to governments. It would get stolen or go awry. So I think that the key to development assistance is practical, measurable, monitorable projects and programs rather than giving money. For example, I have for many years advocated, now it's happening, the mass distribution of anti-malaria bed nets. That's something that you can do through the Red Cross, church groups, and many other organizations. You can go and check that they're there. They're actually hard to stick into safe deposit boxes, and that kind of aid, I think, works very well. Training community health workers and getting artemisinin and combination drugs combined with the bed nets is something that we certainly can do. So in general, we should be clever about the kind of assistance that we give, rather than thinking that this is a matter of trust or faith, which it can't be. It has to be basically viewed from a systems and program management point of view. We now have good information technology for barcoding the flow of commodities, for recording the logistics operations. There are dedicated people all over Africa, indeed all over the poor world, that can help to manage the logistics. But we need to keep pretty practical and down to the ground. I'm not a huge fan of other kinds of aid that sponsor lots of meetings, reports, expert visits, and so forth. I want to keep things very, very practical. One of the most important things we can do is to help boost food production. And the defining problem of food production in Africa and in Haiti, by the way, is that peasant farmers are so poor that they don't use improved inputs. And improved inputs in this context means hybrid seed, for example, or a bag of fertilizer, or small-scale equipment, a treadle pump, for example. So a case in point of what can be done is Malawi, a country where I've been working with the president for a number of years. He had the very wonderful idea 5 years ago to give every household a voucher ticket that could be redeemed for a 50-kilogram bag of fertilizer and for a tin of seed. And on that very basic approach, they have been able to get fertilizer and seed to 1.2 million households in the countryside and double the food production each year after 2005 compared to the pre-2005. This is the, if one were to do this in other places, some fertilizer would go missing, no doubt, some would be stolen. But in general, that very kind of practical aid could be delivered systematically. Farmers would expect the fertilizer to be coming. They would understand the timing of the planting season and when things would arrive. And if there were large-scale diversions, you'd know about it and be able to get it under control. So the point is, absolutely in weak, poor, uninstitutionalized environments, as well as in lobby-infested Washington, there's lots of corruption unless you monitor it. Incidentally, one of the main things that's happened in our own government, just to continue on that point with a serious note, is that we, of course, privatized an increasing amount of our government in the last 20 years, but because we hate bureaucracy, we didn't increase the staffing to oversee these contracts. So we literally have tens of billions of dollars of contracts going out with anybody monitoring them. And we couldn't even trace the money we put into Iraq, not into Iraqi hands, through our own hands, through Blackwater and all the rest. There was a story today about some interesting uses of the Blackwater funds, not appropriate for mixed company. So the point is, any kind of government process, just like any kind of business, requires a systematic application of information technology and basic management. And without that, it won't work.
Good evening, Dr. Sachs. Your closing remarks brought a strong image from Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove to mind, where every scene in the Air Force Base had somehow worked into the background, peace is our business. In turn, imagine for a moment that we are a room full not of pacifists, but of hawks. I'd be curious to see what you would argue to the military-industrial complex of our great nation. What is the economic interest of peace?
Well, you know, we have wonderful engineering capacity in Boeing and Raytheon and other companies. And we also have a huge need, not for these weapon systems, which are so much a waste of money that often the generals don't want them, but Congress votes them anyway because they're jobs in the district. Our real engineering needs are a fundamental overhaul of our energy system, a fundamental renovation of our basic infrastructure. We should have fast light rail, intercity rail. We should be producing clean energy sources and plenty of things for our a generation of electric vehicles. In fact, President Obama talks a lot about that, and he's right about that. And that's where our engineering talent should be used and where it should be deployed. So I don't have great answers for the arms contractors about their arms business. I regard most of it as at best a waste of money, and at worst something fundamentally more dangerous than that. But I would say to the engineers in our country, we have some huge, wonderful things to do, and these companies could be part of the solution. They're among the premier engineering firms of the world. We do a tremendous amount of R&D in these firms, unfortunately, for weapon systems. If we were putting in a similar kind of energy into our energy systems, we'd first be the world leaders of sustainable energy. Second, we wouldn't be experiencing the kind of climate change that is sending these places into collapse.
Thank you for your talk. At the beginning of your talk, you talked a bit about the environmental problems that are leading to some conflicts. And then you showed the chart of rainfall in Darfur, where you pointed out in the 70s it began to decrease more. And I was thinking, well, what else is going on in the 70s? And I'm thinking particularly about increasingly liberalized global economics that becomes much more common around the world. And then you started to touch on this in your response to the first question. And I was wondering, in what ways do you think increasingly liberalized economic policies have also exacerbated these environmental challenges and have contributed to some of these conflicts?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and complex question. In general, I'm a believer in a linked world economy because I think that it's the best chance actually to bring the benefits of science and technology to most of the world. And in fact, when one asks the very complicated question of how is the world's distribution of well-being changing over time, and what has globalization meant for the poor? Basically, one can say the following in a very, very, very rough summary. For a lot of the world's poor, the globalized economy of the last 25 years has been a huge benefit. The benefits have been seen first and foremost in China, which was a very poor country up until the late 1970s, when China opened the economy to international trade and finance. And the benefits are also being seen in India. Between the two countries, that's 38% of the world's population, 1.3 billion people in China and almost 1.2 billion people in India now, so 2.5 billion of our nearly 7 billion population. Globalization in both those countries has been a very important driver of economic improvement. Places that started absolutely impoverished, however, and had other disabilities, for instance, water stress, lack of basic infrastructure, landlockedness, distance from the coast, being high in the mountains and so forth, often could not catch any of that wave of world markets and found themselves basically either abandoned by the world markets or even suffering, ironically, because the few skilled people became more mobile and left. So the country suffered brain drain. They also imported climate change and other problems. Now, while it's true, just to add one more layer to this onion that one has to peel, and I'm now going outward, I guess, while it's true that China and India and Southeast Asia and some other parts of the world like Brazil have been relative beneficiaries of globalization, absolute beneficiaries, their economic growth is now making more complicated the global climate and energy challenges. So it's not an unmitigated blessing either for themselves or for the world. China this year became the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, overtaking the United States. Now, we still are the biggest emitter per person, 20 tons, and China's about 5 tons of CO2 5 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. But because China has more than 4 times our population, they have outpaced the U.S. in absolute emissions. So the story is something like the following. Many parts of the poor world have been beneficiaries of globalization. Some parts of the poor world, for instance, Afghanistan, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, have not. They've been they've been abandoned by the world market because there's nothing of interest of the world market for them. They're suffering globally induced calamities, most likely on the climate. They suffer brain drain and other infirmities from globalization, and their crisis deepens. So it's a complicated picture. And at the same time, the fact that the world economy as a whole, because of globalization, and especially because of the growth of the emerging market economies, meaning Brazil, China, India, and so forth, has been so rapid, the global environmental crisis has definitely accelerated. So too has a global food crisis, because we're pushing against food supplies now in ways that we've not been for a long time. Hunger is on the rise. The real price of food has gone up significantly. Real energy prices have increased significantly in the last few years as well. So we have crises of poverty, climate change, we have crises of poverty in some parts of the world, and we have crises of global environmental change in virtually all parts of the world. And military approaches do nothing for either of them, one could say. In other words, our real challenge, what I believe will be the challenge of the students' generation, second to none, will be the challenge of sustainable development. And that is, how does a world that is now completely interconnected face the development challenges, starting with the poorest of the poor, but also including the middle-income countries seeking to become richer, and put that into alignment with a growing crisis of environmental threat and catastrophe, which goes, by the way, far beyond climate change. It includes climate change, it includes species extinction, land use change, nitrogen flux, water crisis, invasive species, zoonotic disease. There's a whole host of environmental crises that are coming because of human pressures on the environment. And let me add one more dimension, if I could. The world's population continues to increase by 75 to 80 million net per year. We're still on a path to reach 9 billion or more people by mid-century from today's nearly 7 billion people. We're bursting at the seams. And this is something also that needs tending to. We need to help promote a voluntary reduction of fertility rates in the poorest countries where fertility rates remain 6 or 7 or 8 children per woman, which is true in a lot of the poorest parts of the world. So there are many interconnected problems. They happen to be, on the one hand, the most serious problems we face, on the other hand, almost completely outside our news, our politics, and our headlines. Don.
Question over here.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
As you probably know, recently there was a huge earthquake in Haiti. Are you doing anything to develop peace there?
So the Haiti earthquake may end up being, could end up being the deadliest earthquake in history, or it's already perhaps within the top 5 deadliest earthquakes. It's important to understand why. First, of course, was a huge earthquake itself, 7.0 on the Richter scale. And it was near the surface, about 6 kilometers down, and it was in an epicenter very close to the capital. So everything was bad luck. But it's notable that this earthquake took more than 200,000 lives, whereas an even larger earthquake, 7.2 on the Richter scale, in Kobe, Japan, in 1995, same epicenter, very close by the capital city of a much bigger city of 10 million people. Also, a shallow earthquake took about 5,000 lives. So what we're seeing in Haiti is not only a seismic catastrophe, but we're seeing deaths due to poverty. Of course, the structures that people lived in were not reinforced. The walls and the ceilings were not properly protected against earthquakes, so the walls buckled and the ceilings pancaked and crushed nearly 200,000 people, and then others are dying of their injuries and of exposure and other causes now. So the first thing that one can say is that we knew that Haiti was impoverished. When you see a catastrophe like this earthquake, you're always seeing the interaction of the physical shock and the human vulnerability. And in this case, the human vulnerability was extreme. It poses lots of questions. And one major question to ask is, how is it that a country an hour and a half from Miami was one of the poorest places in the world? And we've been given a big dose of ignorance in our press about this recently. never fail to be amazed by the ignorance that David Brooks can bring to a question, for example. I don't know if he's ever right, but he is so frequently obnoxious. What's the matter? I think, okay. He said that the problem was voodoo. He actually wrote this a few days after 200,000 people had been crushed to death, which is surely astounding prejudice and ignorance. One of the things that it was U.S. policy over a long period of time, including the fact that in the early 1990s, when the generals that we had trained finally were thrown out by an election, and President Aristide came to power, and then he was thrown out by one of the American-trained generals again. The U.S. response was a trade embargo on Haiti. This is almost always an absurd approach to problems like this, because you crush countries this way. And Haiti had a small manufacturing sector. It employed about 400,000 people making American baseball bats and baseballs and apparel and so forth. It all disappeared. It all went away with the trade embargo. And then Aristide was brought back in by President Clinton, and then the Clinton administration got cold feet and insisted that he leave office after the final 2 years of what would have been his 5-year term, and more instability resulted. Then President Aristide came back in 2001 in an election. The Bush administration was so ideological, and it had so many of the irresponsible people who had led the Contra effort of the 1980s, that they went after Aristide in every way that they could, including a U.S. Arm twisting of the multilateral agencies like the World Bank to stop any development loans to Haiti for 4 years. Then one day, you may recall, President Aristide was visited by the U.S. ambassador, who told him that he had to flee for his life because there was an insurrection coming. And there just happened to be a little plane with an unmarked tail that would take him away for safety. And the next thing the president knew was that he got off the plane in the Central African Republic. Now, I've tried to find out which commercial airline that is that did that, but you can imagine it's one of our agency airplanes. So we contributed to putting Aristide out of office after having used a trade embargo to bring him back in. All of this is to say, and I'll come to your question in a moment, when you see poverty, you have to think about the history, the underlying causes. What's going on? Something's not right. And this relationship between the U.S. and Haiti has been a pathological relationship for a long time. Our press doesn't cover it, and the realities are very unhappy realities. Well, when President Preval came into office a few years ago, he asked me to help him, which I was very happy to do. And I made several visits to Haiti. The international community, which is needed to help Haiti, wasn't really doing very much help during this period. And then in 2008, Haiti got hit by 4 hurricanes in a row. And Gonaïves and other cities of Haiti were devastated by floods. I went back to Port-au-Prince to see the president then. I helped to draft a plan of action. The international community, as we call it, that includes the United States and France, the rest of Europe, and so forth, spent all of 2009 talking rather than doing. So between 4 hurricanes in 2008 and the earthquake of a few weeks ago nothing was done to help Haiti. Now we have, again, a short period of outpouring of course, genuine affection by the American people and pronouncements by our government about how important Haiti is and how we're going to be there to rebuild. The American government has never shown in history any attention span vis-a-vis Haiti for rebuilding. So what I'm advocating is not going to happen. That's usually the truth of, or that's often the truth of my advice. But I'm suggesting that the United States, rather than standing up and saying, we'll do it and we love Haiti, would simply appropriate funds and deposit them in the Inter-American Development Bank for a multilateral funding effort to finance the reconstruction process, and not make it a U.S.-led or U.S.-only effort, but make it a worldwide effort. I've tried to make at a distance some calculations about how much would be needed, and it's a minimum of $5 to $10 billion, probably $10 billion at a minimum, to be able to pick up the pieces and give Haiti a basic chance to feed itself and start normal economic life. And now we'll see for the next few weeks. There's lots of politics underway right now about who will do what. There's lots of turf fighting about who will have the lead in all of this, but the truth is, when the cameras go off, history has shown time and again that Haiti is simply forgotten and abandoned, and the question is whether it will be different this time. What would one do? Basically, Haiti is more than half still a farm country, and it's just like the African countries that I mentioned. In fact, in the countryside, it's indistinguishable from an African village. Same crops and the same very low yield. If we made the kind of investments that I talked about in seed and fertilizer and agricultural equipment, Haiti could double or triple its agricultural production within a few years. If we helped Haiti to build a road system and electricity, it could reestablish the basic port industries the same way. There's also, of course, wonderful beaches that have seen very few tourists in the last 20 years, and so there's a tourist industry that could develop as well. In short, it would not be hard, with a real partnership carried out over a 5 to 10 year period, to help Haiti not only to rebuild, but actually to escape from the trap of poverty.
Jeff, I think if it's okay with you, we'll take one more question, and I'd like that to go to one of our students.
Great.
Kevin?
You argue that areas of conflict and violence are a result of poverty and hunger. How would you argue your point of changing funds from military expenses to help those in hunger, when many would argue that the military expenses are actually helping the areas of conflict?
In other words, how could one convince people to make some change in this allocation? Yeah, what I've said to the White House, again, so far without much resonance, is that it can't quite be right to spend $100 billion in Afghanistan on the military approach and only $1 billion on the development approach. And so I'm still hoping that this White House will, because I believe that President Obama knows it, but the momentum makes it hard, that we could find a way to scale up the development approach and make a serious effort. Then when it works, build on what we've done. And they're talking about this, but in a very, I find, a very unprofessional way. They're talking about paying money to the Taliban soldiers who will come onto our side. This is a very crude version of what I'm talking about. I think also not very sophisticated, because how do you know they're on, quote, our side after you take the money? There does seem to me to be a little bit of an incentive problem here. in how that's managed. And it was designed by generals. It was not designed by development specialists. Development specialists in Afghanistan know what the villages are like. They know what the challenges in the villages are. And they do have a high level of consensus, actually, that it would be possible to make a village-based approach. I'm also suggesting the same thing in the Drylands. I've recently launched a couple of weeks ago in Nairobi what we're calling a Drylands Initiative. And we launched it, our institute, together with the regional organization for East and Southern Africa, something called COMESA. We had a meeting where we asked the countries of the Drylands of East Africa to come meet in Nairobi. And immediately 18 ministers, that is Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Pastoralism, Minister of Water, came from 6 of the countries to Nairobi for brainstorming. So we had ministers from Ethiopia, from Eritrea, from Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, and Djibouti. And then afterwards, the president of Somalia asked for help as well. And the idea of that initiative is to make ground-based development programs in these places where violence is either already present or encroaching, to help people have livelihoods, clinics, schools, mobile phones, water supply, adequate food, and so forth. And I've met again recently with the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, a very esteemed and very knowledgeable Brigadier General, Scott Gratian, with whom I'd worked before, and suggested that we team up in this effort. So in general, what I find is you have to be persistent. You don't get a yes the first time. It takes months or years. Sometimes everything else is tried first. And then finally they say, well, what was that idea about development? Maybe we should have a talk about it. And then if the idea is right, and I'm confident that it is right, then at least you get started, prove results, it opens some more eyes, and you create some kind of momentum on this. It's fitting, let me say a word in conclusion about Quaker leadership on issues like this. The Quakers were in the lead of the fight against slavery, which in England started around 1770 in an organized way. And it took 60 years for success. There were some successes, little successes along the way. Slave trade was stopped before slavery itself was stopped. There were all sorts of bizarre arguments that had to be used. One of the main arguments in ending slavery in the Caribbean was, in fact, that yes, while it would hurt the British planters, this was the argument used in the English Parliament, it would hurt the English planters who owned the slaves, but it would hurt the French planters even more. And so it was used as a geopolitical argument. And eventually, in 1834, slavery was eliminated in the British Empire. And that, to my mind, it was always an example of what is the prime virtue of all social movements and social action by far, and that's persistence. Nothing comes easily. Nothing comes fast. You don't win the argument the first time around. There's a lot of vested interest. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of mindset. There's a lot of inertia. And if we're going to find peace through sustainable development, it's going to be something that you and all of you in your generation are going to have to do, because we're not going to get to it in time. It's going to be your battle, and I would just ask you to keep at it and keep with it, and you'll have success. Thanks very much.
Jeff, we thank you for your words and for your work, and you have an open invitation to Friends Seminary anytime. Thank you and have a great night. Thanks for being here.